Start with a steel bar. It is a fixed post, roughly waist height, sticking up out of a workbench in a factory in western Ohio. It does not move and it has no motor, and it has been doing the same job for 70 years. So what happens at it? A football arrives at that bench inside out. 4 panels of cowhide, sewn together on the wrong side so the stitching will be hidden, forming a leather bag turned in on itself. It is stiff. It is the wrong shape. It looks like a mistake. It goes into a steam box for about 30 seconds to soften the hide. Then a person picks it up, jams it down over that steel bar, and forces it right side out with their hands and their body weight. That is it. That is the step. There is no machine anywhere in the world that does it. Every football used in every National Football League game, including every Super Bowl ever played, has been turned right side out by a human being leaning on a steel post in Ada, Ohio. The best turners can do one in under a minute. A good turner does 500 or 600 a day, and I want to introduce you to a man who did that for 44 years. His name is Charlie Moore. He worked in the Wilson Football Factory in Ada as a turner, which is by common agreement the most physically punishing job in the building, from the 1970s until his retirement. Wilson estimates that over his career, Charlie Moore turned more than 1 million footballs. More than 1 million. By hand. One at a time, over a steel bar. He is a Dallas Cowboys fan, which is its own small joke given where he lives, and when he was asked about the toll of it, he gave an answer that I think about a lot. 44 years I turned footballs, he said, laughing. Never hurt my hands until I retired. Never hurt my hands until I retired. And when he did retire, the town and the company did something for him that I have not seen anybody do for a factory worker anywhere else in America. So what did they do? They changed the address. The Wilson Football Factory's street address was officially renamed. It is now on Charles Moore Turn, a road named after a man, using the name of the operation he performed 1 million times. Hold on to Charlie Moore, because this entire video is going to come back to that steel bar, and by the end, you will understand why a $100 billion sports league depends on it. Now, I have made a lot of these videos, and they all have the same shape. A great American factory, skilled workers, a product made better there than anywhere. And then a slow, grinding, usually unfair collapse, ending with an empty building and a town holding the bill. Maytag in Newton, Iowa, Winchester in New Haven, Zenith in Chicago, Packard in Detroit, Polaroid in Massachusetts, Pobst in Milwaukee, Atari in Sunnyvale. Every single one of those was a labor-intensive operation in an American town where people did skilled work with their hands, and every single one of them was destroyed by some combination of automation, offshoring, or scale. And Ada, Ohio? It has all of the same characteristics. A town of about 5,800 people, roughly 140 union workers, a product assembled almost entirely by hand, using sewing machines from the middle of the 20th century, with a plant average of about 20 years of seniority. Piecework, cowhide, no robots. By every rule the other stories establish, Ada should have died in about 1988. It did not. It is running right now. In June 2024, Wilson opened a brand new 80,000 square foot factory there, more than twice the size of the old one, after a $15 million investment, and signed a new long-term deal with the NFL. So this video is a different kind of question. Not why did it fail? Why didn't it? And the answer, when we get to it, is not what you would guess, and it is not comforting either. So what is the scale of what happens in that building? Ada is about 70 miles south of Toledo, a little over 2 hours from Cleveland, in flat Ohio farm country. The town has a population under 6,000. The largest employer is Ohio Northern University. The second largest is the football factory. That factory produces somewhere in the region of 500,000 to 700,000 leather footballs a year, depending on the year and who is counting. On a normal day, it makes around 2,500, and with the new plant, the target is 3,000. Of that annual output, about 27,000 balls go to the National Football League. Each NFL team receives roughly 780 game balls a season. Each team brings 24 balls to a regular season game, 12 primary and 12 backup. For the Super Bowl, the number rises to 54 per team. Every one of those balls was made in Ada. Every point ever scored in the National Football League since 1941 was scored with a ball made by Wilson, and since 1955, every one of those balls has come out of that town. Every Super Bowl. All of them, from the first one in January 1967, when Green Bay beat Kansas City at the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum, straight through to the most recent one. Now hold that against one more fact, which is the one that starts to explain everything. Wilson makes a great many other things: tennis rackets, volleyballs, pickleball paddles, basketballs, golf clubs. Almost all of it is manufactured overseas, in Vietnam and China, and elsewhere, the way essentially all sporting goods have been made for decades. The footballs are not. And why not? Not because Wilson is sentimental. The reason is that the National Football League requires its game balls to be made in the United States. It is in the deal. That single contractual requirement is the reason 140 people in a small Ohio town still have those jobs, and it is the reason this story ends differently from every other one I have told you. But we should go back to the beginning, because the ball itself has a history, and it is not the one people assume. Start with the word pigskin, because it is wrong, and it has been wrong for over a century. No football used in the National Football League has ever been made of pigskin. Not one. They are cowhide, and they have been cowhide for as long as anybody has been keeping proper records. The word comes from the 1800s, when the ball was made from an inflated pig bladder, obtained from meat packers, with a leather casing sewn around it. The bladder was the pig part. It was not the skin, and it was inside. And what shape was it? Round. Roughly spherical, closer to a modern soccer ball or a rugby ball than to anything you would recognize now. The first game of American football is usually dated to 1869 on a university field in New Jersey, and the ball used in it was large and round. It was awkward to carry and essentially impossible to throw with any accuracy. Now this is the part I find interesting, because the shape of the ball is not a design decision. It is a fossil of a rule change. Early football was a running game. You do not need a throwable ball for a running game, you need a carryable one, and a round ball is fine for that. Then the forward pass was legalized, and the sport began to shift toward passing, and the ball had to change to keep up. It got narrower at the ends. It got smaller in circumference. The prolate spheroid shape that we now think of as the definitive form of a football is the direct physical consequence of a rules committee deciding that men could throw it. And what made the modern ball possible? The vulcanized rubber bladder, developed around the turn of the 20th century. A rubber liner holds air far more reliably than a pig bladder, and crucially, it holds a precise and repeatable shape. That is when a football stops being an approximation and becomes a manufactured object with tolerances. So where does Wilson come in? Wilson Sporting Goods is a Chicago company, and its origins are the kind of thing that sounds made up. It grew out of a meatpacking operation. A packing company in the early 20th century had enormous quantities of animal byproduct, including hides and gut, and somebody worked out that hides make balls and gut makes tennis racket strings. That is the actual industrial logic of American sporting goods in that era. The equipment came out of the slaughterhouse. The moment that matters for this story is 1940 and 1941. George Halas owned the Chicago Bears. He had co-founded the league that became the NFL back in 1920, and he was one of the 2 or 3 most powerful men in professional football. Tim Mara owned the New York Giants, which he had founded in 1925. Between them, in 1940, they arranged the agreement that made Wilson Sporting Goods the official football supplier of the National Football League. And then Halas suggested something. Tim Mara had a son named Wellington. He had been named after the Duke of Wellington, and when he had worked around the Giants as a ball boy in 1925, at about 9 years old, the players had started calling him Duke. He preferred it to Wellington, and it stuck for the rest of his life. Halas urged Wilson to honor Mara's role in arranging the deal by naming the ball after his son. So in 1941, Wilson unveiled a redesigned football, and it was called the Duke. That name was on every NFL game ball for the next 28 years, through the whole seminal period of professional football, and then it was removed in 1970 after the merger with the American Football League. The most likely reason, according to people who have looked at it, is that the merged league did not want the Giants family nickname on the ball in what was a somewhat hostile marriage. The ball then had no official name for 35 years. And on October 25, 2005, Wellington Mara died at 89, having spent his life as one of the most influential owners in the history of American sport. He was the man who, along with his brother, agreed in the early 1960s to share national television revenue across the whole league, which is the single decision that allowed small market teams in Green Bay and Pittsburgh to survive alongside New York. 2 days before he died, the Giants beat Denver on a touchdown pass with 5 seconds left, and the players gathered in a circle in the locker room and chanted his nickname, Duke. The following year, Wilson put the name back on the ball, and it has been there ever since. So the object at the center of the most watched sporting event in America carries the childhood nickname of a 9-year-old ball boy from 1925, restored to the leather because he died. And there is a small poignancy in that name being restored, which is worth a sentence. For 35 years, from 1970 to 2005, the ball had no name on it. An entire generation of American football, the era of the Steel Curtain and Montana, and the 80s, was played with an anonymous object. The name came back only because the man died, which means that if you watch a game today and see the Duke stamped into the leather, you are looking at a memorial, and almost nobody watching knows it. Now, Ada. The factory building in Ada was opened in the 1930s by a company called the Ohio-Kentucky Manufacturing Company. Wilson took the operation over, and from 1955 onward, Ada has made the NFL's footballs, which makes it, by Wilson's own description and by most accounts, the world's oldest factory dedicated solely to producing game-ready footballs for a professional league. 71 years, and consider what happened to American manufacturing across that span. In 1955, when Ada started making NFL footballs, the United States was the workshop of the world. Newton, Iowa was making washing machines. New Haven was making rifles. Chicago was making televisions by the million. Detroit was Detroit. Milwaukee was brewing more beer than any city on earth. The country made shoes and furniture and textiles and radios and cameras, mostly in small and medium towns, mostly by hand or by hand-tended machine. Every single one of those industries left. Not most. All of them in that form. And the little factory in Ada, Ohio, which had none of the advantages any of those places had, no scale, no capital, no technology, no port, no research operation, kept making footballs the whole way through. It was there for the entire collapse, and it did not notice. That is the fact this video exists to explain. 71 years in one town. And it is worth asking how a town like Ada ended up with it, because there is no obvious reason. Ada is not near anything. It is not a port. It is not a rail hub in any meaningful modern sense. It is not near the leather supply, which is in Chicago, and it is not near the league offices, which are in New York. It is farm country in Hardin County, Ohio. What it had was a building and a workforce. Small manufacturing operations of that kind were scattered all over the rural Midwest in the first half of the 20th century, in towns exactly like Ada, making leather goods and gloves and harnesses and sporting equipment, because that is where the labor was, and the buildings were cheap, and the skills existed. Almost all of them are gone now. That entire category of small-town light manufacturing has been erased from the American map so thoroughly that most people under 40 do not know it existed. Ada is a survivor of that world, not the beginning of something new. The reason it is remarkable is not that it was ever unusual. It is that everything around it disappeared, and it did not. The other thing Ada has is Ohio Northern University, which sits in the same small town and is the largest employer. So you have a community of under 6,000 people with a university and a factory, which is a combination that keeps a downtown alive and keeps young people around long enough to consider staying. That matters more than it sounds. A lot of the towns in this series had a factory and nothing else, and when the factory went, there was no second thing. Ada has a second thing. So what actually happens in there? Let me walk you through it, because the process is strange, and it explains everything that follows. So where does a football start? With a cow. The leather comes from Horween, a family tannery in Chicago that has been operating since the early 20th century, and Wilson buys something in the region of 15,000 to 20,000 feet of cowhide per week. 15,000 feet of leather. Every week, for footballs. The hide arrives at Ada in large pieces, and the first job is cutting. A cutter takes a hide and cuts panels from it in one of 5 sizes: pee-wee, junior, youth, high school and collegiate, and official NFL. One hide yields enough for roughly 10 to 12 4-panel footballs, and cutting is not a mechanical exercise because a cowhide is not a uniform material. It is an animal. It has thick areas and thin areas, scars, brands, insect bites, grain variation. A cutter has to read the hide, work out where the good leather is, and lay the panels out to get maximum yield while making sure every panel is sound. Then comes matching, which is the part nobody thinks about. The 4 panels that go into one football have to match each other, in thickness, in grain, in stretch. If one panel is meaningfully different from the other 3, the finished ball will not be symmetrical, and a football that is not symmetrical does not spiral properly. Cheryl Mullins has been a cutter at that factory for over 40 years. She and the other cutters average around 1,200 cut panels a day. And a word about Horween, because they are the other survivor in this story. Horween is a family tannery on the north side of Chicago, running since the early 20th century, and it is one of the last significant leather tanneries left in the United States. Tanning is dirty, slow, chemically intensive work, and it left America in bulk decades ago for the same reasons everything else did. Horween stayed, largely by specializing at the top of the market. They supply leather for high-end footwear, for baseball gloves, for the NBA's basketballs, and for the footballs in Ada, which means the supply chain for an NFL football is 2 surviving American craft manufacturers feeding each other. A Chicago tannery that should have closed, sending 15,000 feet of hide a week to an Ohio factory that should have closed. Neither of them survived because of general conditions in American manufacturing. Both survived by being the last one somebody specific still wanted. Then the panels get a lining, bonded to the back, which is what stops the leather stretching out of shape over the life of the ball, and they get the branding stamped on. Then they go to the sewers. And here is where the process does the thing that sounds insane the first time you hear it. The ball is sewn together inside out. Why would you do that? Because of where the stitching ends up. If you sew the panels together on the outside, the seam and the thread sit proud on the surface of the ball, exposed to grass, turf, hands, weather, and the impact of being thrown and kicked at high speeds several hundred times. If you sew it inside out and then reverse it, the seam is on the inside. The thread is protected. The outside surface is clean leather with only the seam line showing. So a sewer takes 2 panels, runs them through a machine, adds the third, adds the fourth, all with the grain facing in, leaving one seam open. About 250 stitches hold an NFL game ball together, and the machines they use are old. Not old in the sense of well-maintained. Old in the sense that a reporter who visited described sewing machines from the middle of the 20th century still running the line. And there is a constraint on all of this that I have not mentioned, which is that the ball has to hit a specification, and the specification is unforgiving. An NFL football has to fall within a defined range for length, for the long circumference around the points, for the short circumference around the middle, for weight, and for inflation pressure. Those tolerances are narrow, and they are checked. Now hold that against the material. The panels are cut from a cow. Hides vary in thickness and in stretch. Leather absorbs moisture from the air, which changes its weight and its behavior. A panel that measures correctly in the morning is not necessarily the same panel in the afternoon. So the factory's actual job is to produce an object of controlled dimensions out of a material that will not hold still, 2,500 times a day, every day. That is why the matching step matters so much, and why cutters spend 40 years learning it. It is also why the plant average is 20 years of seniority. You cannot hand somebody a hide on their first week and expect a ball that passes. Then the ball goes to the turn. The steam box, 30 seconds, and then the steel bar, and a person putting their entire upper body into forcing a stiff leather bag the right way round. I want you to try to picture it properly, because I think the words hand-turned do not convey it. You are pushing a rigid, warm, slippery object down over a fixed steel post, working the leather over inch by inch, fighting the material's resistance. using the bar as a lever against your own weight. Then you work it around until the whole thing has inverted. Then you do it again, 500 times, in a shift. Jimmy Conley, a turner at the plant, has turned up to 600 balls in a day. Charlie Moore did it for 44 years and turned over 1 million. That is the job that has never been automated, and we will come back to why. After the turn, the ball goes back to the sewers so the last seam can be closed, this time from the outside, because there is no other way to do it once the ball is right side round. And then the bladder. Every football has an inflatable bladder inside it, and Wilson's is proprietary. It is essentially a rubber inner casing, and the process for making it is one of the company's closely held pieces of knowledge. Willie Smith made the bladders at Ada for 27 years. He was the only person who made them, and his name appears on everyone. Think about that arrangement for a moment. One man in one room, in one small Ohio town, making the single component that goes inside every football used in the largest sport in America, and signing each one. The bladder is inserted through the open lace hole, and then comes lacing, which is entirely by hand. The laces on a football are not decoration, and they are not a closure in the way people assume. They are a grip feature. A quarterback's fingers go on the laces, and the laces are what allow him to impart spin. The spacing, the tension, and the height of the lacing directly affect how the ball throws. Donna Conley has been hand-lacing footballs at that factory for more than 30 years. She is Jimmy Conley's mother, and they work in the same building. And a detail about the laces that I like. An NFL ball has double laces, and the lacing is set into a channel so that it stands proud of the surface by a controlled amount. Too flush and there is nothing to grip. Too proud and the ball catches on the hand at release. A hand lacer is therefore not threading a shoe. They are setting a grip surface to a tolerance, by feel, several hundred times a day, and the consequence of getting it wrong lands on somebody throwing a football 60 yards on national television. Then the ball is inflated, checked for shape, weighed, measured, pressure tested, and inspected. All in, the production process runs to about 20 distinct steps. Wilson estimates that roughly 50 pairs of hands touch a single NFL football during its manufacture. 50 people, on one ball. And from rawhide to finished football takes about 3 days, and then, after all of that, the ball is not finished. The last thing Ada does is inspect it, and inspection at that plant is done the way everything else there is done, by a person looking at it and handling it. Every ball sold as an official game ball has been hand-inspected against the same specification the on-field balls meet, which is a slightly remarkable claim when you multiply it out. 500,000 footballs a year, each one physically examined. Now let me give you the summary sentence for all of that, because I want it stated plainly before we get to the argument. In an 80,000 square foot building in a town of under 6,000 people, about 140 union workers use mid-century sewing machines, steam, steel bars, hand tools, and their own bodies to produce 2,500 leather objects a day, at a rate of roughly 1 every 20 seconds across the building for the wealthiest sports league on Earth. Nothing about that sentence should be true in 2026, which brings us to the question this whole video exists to answer. Why has nobody automated it? What is the technical answer? It is real, and it is not trivial, because it is real, and it is not trivial. Leather is a natural material with variable properties. Every hide is different, and every panel within a hide is different. Automated systems are extremely good at handling uniform material with predictable behavior, and extremely bad at handling material that changes under the tool. The turning operation in particular is a hard robotics problem. You are asking a machine to manipulate a floppy, variable, high-friction object through a topological inversion, applying enough force to overcome the leather's resistance without tearing it, while continuously adjusting to how the material is actually behaving in that moment. Human hands are still better at that class of problem than anything on the market at reasonable cost. The volumes are also small. 500,000 units a year sounds like a lot until you set it against, say, a consumer electronics line that produces that in a week. Automation pays off when you amortize the equipment across enormous volume, and at Ada's scale, the numbers do not obviously work. All of that is true, and any engineer would tell you the same. But is that the real answer? I do not think so, and here is why. If the National Football League wanted an automated football, that ball could be designed. You would not automate the current process. You would change the product. Use synthetic panels with consistent thickness. Mold the shape. Bond the seams instead of sewing them. Eliminate the inversion problem entirely by constructing the ball differently. This is not speculative. Almost every other ball in modern sport has gone through that transition. Soccer balls are thermally bonded now. Basketballs are composite. The hand-stitched leather ball is a 19th century object, and every other sport has moved on from it. And the resulting football would almost certainly be more consistent than a leather one. Same weight every time, same shape every time, no variation from hide to hide, no difference between a ball made on a humid Tuesday and one made in January, so the technical answer is not sufficient. A more uniform football is available. The league does not want it. Which brings us to the actual mechanism, and it took me a while to see it. If you have made it this far into a story about a football factory, subscribe, because this channel is built for exactly this, the thing underneath the famous thing. The National Football League is not buying a football. It is buying an unbroken line. Every point since 1941, every Super Bowl since 1967, the name of a ball boy from 1925 stamped into the leather. A town of 5,800 people in Ohio, a man who turned 1 million balls and got a street named after him. None of that is performance. A ball does not throw better because a person in Ada made it, but all of it is enormously valuable to a league whose product is not really football, it is continuity. Think about what the NFL actually sells. It sells the idea that what you are watching on a Sunday in November is the same thing your father watched and his father watched. Records that stretch back decades, franchises with 100-year histories, statistics compared across eras as though the eras were commensurable. The ball is the physical guarantor of that claim. It is the one object that has been present at every single moment of the league's history, and it is still made by hand in the same town by people whose parents made it. Automate it, and that stops being true, permanently, and it can never be made true again. So what is the mechanism? Let me state it as cleanly as I can. Authenticity is the only industrial asset that is destroyed by the act of scaling it. Every other advantage a manufacturer can have survives being made more efficient. If you find a way to make a better bearing more cheaply, you have a better bearing more cheaply. Efficiency and quality are compatible. But if the thing you are selling is that it was made by hand, in that place, by those people, the moment you automate it, or move it, or scale it, the asset evaporates, not diminishes. Evaporates. There is no such thing as a machine-made, handmade football. Which means Ada, Ohio holds the one position in American manufacturing that cannot be competed away because the customer's requirement is that it not be improved. And which direction does the incentive run here? Because it is the opposite of every other manufacturer I have ever covered. In a normal manufacturing relationship, the customer wants the supplier to get cheaper, and every year there is pressure to shave cost out of the process. That pressure is what eventually pushes the work offshore or into a machine, because eventually the only remaining cost to remove is the people. At Ada, the customer's interest runs the other way. The NFL has a positive interest in the ball continuing to be made by hand in Ohio, because the story is worth money to the league. It runs fan events where the factory demonstrates ball making to the public. It talks about the ball's heritage in its own marketing. The supplier's inefficiency is a feature the customer is promoting. I cannot think of another industrial relationship in America that works like that. Now compare that to every other factory in this series, because this is the point. Zenith in Chicago built televisions by hand and advertised it as a virtue. Their advertising said there were no printed circuits and no production shortcuts, and every connection was carefully hand-wired. They meant it as a promise of quality, and it was true, and it destroyed them, because the customer standing in a store did not care how the television was made. The customer cared whether it worked and what it cost, and machines made televisions that worked better and cost less. Maytag in Newton, Iowa spent a century building a reputation for durability, and then the company was bought, and the reputation was carried to Michigan in a briefcase and monetized in Ohio and Mexico, because a reputation is portable and a town is not. Winchester's rifles, Packard's cars, Polaroid's film, Pabst's beer. In every case, the thing of value could be detached from the place that made it, and eventually it was. Ada is the control case. Same profile, opposite outcome. So what is the variable? Not effort, or skill, or loyalty, or luck. The people in Newton and New Haven and Chicago worked just as hard and were just as good. The variable is that Ada's customer has contractually required that the thing not be detachable. The NFL mandates that its game balls be made in the United States. Wilson has been meeting that mandate at that address since 1955. The handmadeness is not the method by which the product is achieved. The handmadeness is the product. That is why the jobs are still there. But now I have to tell you the other half of it, which is less comfortable. If your survival rests on a contract rather than on your competitive position, then you are not safe. You are contingent. Look at what actually protects those 140 jobs. Not productivity, because a machine could probably beat them. Not cost, because Vietnam is cheaper, and Wilson uses Vietnam for everything else it makes. Not irreplaceability of skill, because turning footballs is a skill that could be taught to people in any country on Earth. What protects them is a clause, and the continued preference of a league that has no obligation to keep preferring it. Ada is simultaneously the safest factory in America and one of the most contingent. It has enormous stability, and that stability has one single point of failure, and the point of failure is somebody else's decision. Is that decision being renewed? It is, and the money says it is serious, and the money says it is serious. In June 2024, Wilson opened that new plant. $15 million, 80,000 square feet, more than double the old building, on the same street in the same town. Wilson signed a new multi-year extension of its NFL rights in the same period. Nobody spends $15 million on a facility they intend to close. That is a real vote, in cash, on a 20-year horizon. And it is worth noticing what they did not do with $15 million, which is automate. They built a bigger building for more people to work in by hand. The stated goal is to raise output from about 2,500 balls a day toward 3,000, and to grow annual volume by 20 or 30%, potentially up to 650,000 balls a year. More output, same method, more hands. At the opening in June 2024, one of the people quoted was a Wilson employee of 36 years, who described it as not only a new era, but a continuation of the company's history, and said that the people of Ada were part of the family, which is the kind of thing companies always say at ribbon cuttings, and is worth about as much as ribbon cutting statements usually are. The building is worth more. $15 million of concrete is a harder promise than a quote. That is a company that understands exactly what it is selling. Before that, the Super Bowl balls, because the process for those is its own small ceremony, and it tells you what the object means. Regular season balls are made in batches, stamped generically, and shipped to teams at the start of the year. Super Bowl balls cannot be. They have to carry the names of the two teams playing, and the Super Bowl logo, and nobody knows who those teams are until the conference championship games finish, which is 2 weeks before the game, so the factory waits. On Championship Sunday, the plant holds a pizza party, and the workers watch both games together in the building. Whoever wins, they start making that team's Super Bowl balls the next morning. 54 balls for each team. 108 in total, produced over a couple of days by the same hands that make every other ball, then stamped, inspected, and shipped. On game day, both teams hand their 54 balls over to league administrators for assessment, and the approved balls have a marker applied to the laces so they can be identified as genuine on-field footballs afterward, which matters because a football that was actually used in a Super Bowl is a valuable object, and a football that was not is $100 of leather. Then somebody kicks one, and about 100 million people in the United States look at it at the same moment. That is the annual arc of the Ada factory, not a fiscal year. A season, ending in a single object, being watched by more people simultaneously than watch almost anything else in American life. Now let me deal with the elephant, because if you know one thing about NFL footballs, it is probably this one. In January 2015, after the AFC Championship game, an enormous controversy broke out over whether the New England Patriots had used footballs inflated below the league's required pressure range. It ran for years, through investigations and litigation and a quarterback suspension, and it became one of the most exhaustively argued sports stories of the decade. I am not going to relitigate it. What I want to point out is where ADA sits in it, which is nowhere. The factory does not control the pressure of a ball in a stadium. Balls are inspected by officials roughly 2 hours and 15 minutes before kickoff and have to fall within the league's specified range to be approved for play. What happens to them after that is a matter for the people in the building. More interestingly, the balls each team uses are prepared by that team. Equipment managers break them in using leather treatments, brushes, and a great deal of accumulated private technique because a brand new leather football straight from the factory is slick and stiff and quarterbacks hate them, which means the product ADA ships is deliberately unfinished. Wilson makes a ball to a specification, and then 32 teams take those balls and work them over for days to suit the preferences of one individual quarterback each. Pressure within the legal range, surface texture, the degree of break-in, all of it varies by team and by player. So the ball at the center of the most scrutinized rulebook in American sport is a handmade natural material object that is then modified by the participants before use. The league could eliminate every bit of that ambiguity tomorrow by using a molded synthetic ball with an integrated pressure system, and it does not, and after everything I have just described, I think you can see why. The ambiguity is part of the thing. The ball is supposed to be a physical object with a character, prepared by people, thrown by a person who has opinions about it. They would rather have the argument than lose the object. There is one more piece of the economics worth putting on the table, because the numbers are strange. An official Duke football, the exact model the NFL uses, retails at around $150. You can buy one. It comes from the same building, made by the same people, on the same machines. 27,000 of them go to the league every year, out of an annual production of 500,000 or more, which means the NFL's balls are around 5% of what ADA makes. The other 95% is college, high school, youth, and retail. Wilson is also the official football of the NCAA. The factory makes 5 panel sizes, from Pee-wee up to official NFL, and the bulk of the volume is the smaller ones going to schools and shops. So the NFL contract is not on its own what pays for that factory. The NFL contract is what makes everything else sellable. The reason a high school in Texas buys Wilson, and a sporting goods store stocks it, and a father buys a leather ball for a 9-year-old, is that it is the same brand, from the same building, as the thing on television on Sunday. The 27,000 balls are the argument for the other 500,000. That is the actual commercial structure, and it is worth understanding because it explains why Wilson would spend $15 million on a building for a contract representing 5% of its output. The 5% is the marketing budget for the 95. Now let me go back inside the building, because I have been talking about a mechanism, and the mechanism is made of people. The plant average at ADA is around 20 years of seniority. That is an extraordinary number in modern American manufacturing, and it is worth explaining what it produces. Dan Riegel, who ran the plant for years, put the logic of it plainly. Our plant average is 20 years seniority, he said. If you sew footballs, you do it every day of the year. Whether you have done it for 5 years or 10 or 20, he said, that is what you specialize in, and you are going to make a more quality-oriented, consistent product. That is the whole argument for craft manufacturing in one sentence, and it is the same argument Zenith made in 1965, and it lost there. Here it wins, for the reasons we have been through. The jobs have unusual titles: cutter, sewer, turner, lacer, bladder maker. Bladder maker is not a job title that exists anywhere else in the American economy, and the families run through it. Donna Conley has been lacing footballs for over 30 years. Her son Jimmy turns them, up to 600 a day. They work in the same plant. Jimmy has said his favorite part of the job is being here with my work family and meeting all the people, and in his case, the work family includes actual family. Cheryl Mullins has been cutting for over 40 years. Willie Smith made every bladder for 27. Charlie Moore turned for 44. Add those 4 up and you have well over 140 years of continuous employment in one building among 4 people. The workers are unionized, and they are paid by the piece, which is an old system and a demanding one. Piecework means your earnings track your output directly, which rewards speed and skill and punishes a bad day or an injury. Employees interviewed over the years have said it is a good wage for the area, though the company has not disclosed figures. That last part is worth sitting with. A good wage for the area. Not a great wage by national standards. A good wage in a town of 5,800 people in rural Ohio, where the alternative is the university, agriculture, or a commute. That is what these jobs are, and it is what factory jobs of this kind have always been. Not glamorous, not enormous money, but steady, skilled, local, and available to somebody without a degree, which is precisely the category of employment that has been disappearing from American small towns for 50 years. Ada kept about 140 of them, and there is a thing the workers say in nearly every interview anybody has ever done there, which is about the moment they see it. Dan Riegel described it this way: "My proudest moment every year is when they kick that Super Bowl off. The focus on that ball being kicked off, and to know that football came from Ada, Ohio, and it was made by our people, is just a great feeling." Jimmy Conley described going to the NFL fan event, where the factory used to run a live ball-making demonstration for the public. "Once they see what we do," he said, "they treat us like we're royalty." I want to be careful not to sentimentalize that, because it is easy to, and it would cheapen it. These are industrial jobs done at speed for piece rates, and turning footballs for 44 years is hard on a body no matter how much you love the Cowboys. But there is something real in it that most manufacturing has lost, which is that these workers can see the finished object being used. Almost nobody in modern manufacturing can. If you make a component, it goes into a subassembly that goes into a product that gets shipped somewhere. You never see it again. The people in Ada watch 100 million Americans look at their work simultaneously, once a year, for about 4 hours, and they can identify which specific batch it came from. There is a ritual around it. On the day of the conference championship games, the factory holds a pizza party, and the workers watch both games together in the building, because whoever wins, they are making that team's Super Bowl balls starting the next morning. Then they make them. 54 balls for each team, over a couple of days, stamped with the Super Bowl logo and the 2 team names, and shipped. That is the calendar those 140 people live by. Not quarters. The football season. There is one more thing about that building that I keep returning to. Almost every factory in this series was, at some point, described by somebody as the last of its kind. Winchester's New Haven Works, the Packard plant, Zenith's Chicago line, Polaroid's coding operation. In every case, the phrase was used in the past tense, in an obituary. Ada is the only one where it is a present tense description of a going concern. The world's oldest factory producing only professional game footballs. The last operation of its kind in the country. About 140 people in one building doing something that used to be ordinary and is now singular. And they are not curators. This is not a heritage workshop putting on a demonstration for tourists, although you can in fact book a tour, and there is a museum and a retail store on site, and a portion of the $15 ticket goes to local youth sports. They are running production. 2,500 units a day is a real manufacturing rate. The new plant exists to push it higher. That distinction matters. There is a version of American craft manufacturing that has become essentially a museum with a gift shop, where the making is a performance and the revenue comes from the visit. Ada is not that. The tours are incidental. The building exists to make footballs at volume, and the volume is going up. So what does all of this add up to? I want to lay out the argument once, and then give you the serious counter-argument, because there is one and it matters. The argument is this. Ada. Ohio survives because its customer requires that it not be modernized. The National Football League is buying an unbroken line back to 1941, and an unbroken line is the one product feature that cannot be manufactured more efficiently, because efficiency breaks it. The handmade process is not the means to the product, it is the product. Now the counter-argument. The counter-argument is that I have overstated the mythology and understated the engineering, and it goes like this. A leather football is a good football. Leather grips differently from synthetic in cold and wet conditions. It breaks in, which means it develops a texture specific to how it has been used. Quarterbacks who have thrown these balls their entire lives, from high school through college to the NFL, have muscle memory calibrated to this exact object, and changing it would be a real disruption to the actual playing of the sport. And the hand construction is not merely decorative. 4 leather panels, matched by eye and sewn to a consistent tension, is a way of producing a symmetrical ball out of an asymmetrical material, and doing that reliably at 2,500 a day is a manufacturing achievement, not a heritage exercise. On this reading, Ada survives because it makes the best football, full stop, and all the history is a pleasant story attached to something that is independently good. I think that is partly right, and the strongest version of it is the quarterback point, which is real. The people who use this object have spent 20 years learning its behavior, but I would put one fact next to it. Wilson could make that same leather football, with the same panels and the same laces and the same hand sewing, in Vietnam. The company already has hand assembly operations overseas. There is nothing about leather, or about stitching, or about turning a ball over a steel bar that requires an American to do it. Those are learnable skills, and they are learned everywhere. The reason it does not happen is not capability, it is the clause. So both things are true. The ball is good, and the ball is good in ways that matter to the people throwing it. And the reason it is made in Ada, rather than Ho Chi Minh City, is a contractual requirement that the league has chosen to impose and to keep imposing. Ada is protected by a promise, not by a moat. So what do those jobs actually mean in a place that size? Because the arithmetic of a small town is different. 140 jobs in a city of 1 million is a rounding error. 140 jobs in a town of 5,800 people is something else entirely. Assume most of those workers have a household. That is potentially a couple of hundred people whose mortgage is paid from that building, in a town where the total number of households is perhaps 2,500. Add the spending those wages generate at the shops and the garage and the restaurants and the property taxes and the share of the school district's funding. That is what it means to be the second largest employer in a town of that size. It is not a component of the local economy. It is a substantial fraction of it, which is precisely the profile that made every other town in this series so vulnerable. Newton, Iowa had exactly that concentration, and it was catastrophic when Maytag left. Newhallville had it. Ada has it too. The difference is not that Ada is diversified. The difference is that the thing has not left. And that raises the last question, which is the one I actually wanted to ask when I started this. What is the lesson for everywhere else? Because there is a very tempting version, and it is wrong, and I want to kill it before anybody takes it away from this video. The tempting version says, look, American manufacturing can survive if you do craft work at the high end. Be like Ada. Make something beautiful by hand, and the market will reward you. That is not what happened here, and believing it will get people hurt. Ada is not surviving, because craft beats scale. Zenith proved craft loses to scale, decisively, in a fair fight, on a product where the customer could compare. Maytag proved that 100 years of accumulated reputation can be picked up and carried to another state. Every story in this series is the same result. Ada is surviving because it found the one customer in the world whose requirement is that the product not be improved, and that customer is a sports league whose entire commercial value rests on continuity with its own past. That is not a strategy. It is a niche of one, and it is not replicable, because there are not 30 more national football leagues. So what is the honest lesson? I think it is this, and it is narrower and more useful. When you are trying to work out whether a manufacturing job is safe, do not ask how skilled it is, and do not ask how good the product is. Zenith's workers were extremely skilled, and Zenith's televisions were extremely good. Ask instead whether the customer is buying the object or buying the fact of how it was made. If they are buying the object, then everything about how you make it is a cost, and costs get optimized, and eventually the optimization will find you no matter how good you are. That is not a moral failing on anybody's part. It is arithmetic, and it has run its course through steel, textiles, furniture, appliances, televisions, cameras, and beer, in that order, across the American interior. If they are buying the fact of how it was made, you have something durable, because the customer will actively resist your attempts to improve it. There are not many of those. Ada is one. Certain Kentucky bourbon, certain Swiss watches, a handful of instruments, some food. It is a real category, and it is small. And the second half of that lesson is the harder one. Even inside that category, you are dependent on a story continuing to matter to somebody else. Ada's 140 jobs rest on the NFL's continued interest in its own history. That is currently a very safe bet. It is not the same thing as being unassailable. So let me finish where I started. There is a steel bar in a building in Ada, Ohio, on a street called Charles Moore Turn. Charlie Moore stood at one for 44 years. He put more than 1 million footballs over it. He worked 500 a day, and he laughed about it, and he said it never hurt his hands until he retired. Every point ever scored in the National Football League, going back to 1941, was scored with a ball that a person forced right side out with their hands. Every touchdown you have ever watched, every field goal, every Super Bowl since the first one in January 1967, the Ice Bowl, the Immaculate Reception, every last-second throw you have ever seen a stadium erupt over. Somewhere behind every one of those moments, there is a person in Ohio, standing at a bench, sweating, working a warm piece of cowhide over a fixed steel post, doing it again and again and again, 500 times before the shift ends. The league is worth something north of $100 billion. The television deals run to sums that are difficult to write down. The stadiums cost billions. The broadcast operation is one of the most sophisticated live production systems on Earth. And the single physical object at the center of all of it, the one thing that has been present at every moment of the sport's history, cannot be made by a machine, and the league does not want it to be. 2,500 times a day, in a town of 5,800 people, somebody picks up a leather bag that is inside out and turns it the right way round with their body. That is the whole industry. That is the last one of its kind in America, and the road it sits on is named after a man who did it 1,000,000 times. There is a company in Chicago that put a promise about handmade quality on the front of every television it built, and meant it, and was destroyed by it, for reasons that are the exact mirror image of everything in this video. That one is on the channel, and I would watch it directly after this.